Welcome back. Time now for those two experts. One is John Penrose, former Conservative MP for Weston-super-Mare and author of a new report for the Centre for Policy Studies, of course Margaret Thatcher's favourite think tank, called A Cheaper Route to Net Zero, and also Emma Pinchbeck. She's the Chief Executive of Energy UK, which represents some of the biggest energy providers in the country. I started by asking them, why had net zero become so toxic?
I think that's absolutely the right place to start, because people are saying, well, hang on a second, even if people are willing to accept that climate change is a thing and is a problem, what does that mean? I've got to throw out my boiler and drive a car I don't want to drive, which might run out of charge halfway up the M4. So I think the answer which the centre-right ought to be looking for is to say there are better answers to this. There are better ways of doing it which are more free market, which are cheaper for you and me and your listeners and your viewers, and actually will be a great deal better for our economy too. And if we do it that way around, with consent, with people saying, actually, I can end up with cheaper energy bills as a result of this, then all of a sudden you start getting people saying, hang on a sec, that makes sense from my family's point of view. That makes sense from my lifestyle's point of view. We're all struggling with high energy bills at the moment. If you can cut those for me, then at that point, that could be a real sweet spot for the Conservative Party to operate in.
But how, John, people might be saying, they remember back to David Cameron, votes blue, go green. Mm-hmm. They remember Boris Johnson, big proponent of environmental change and the whole agenda about climate change and tackling climate change. You had 14 years. How did we get into this mess? Why weren't you making those types of arguments you've just said to me over the last 14 years?
I was, but unfortunately I have not yet persuaded everybody. The point about it though now is that we've had actually not just 14 years, because quite a lot of what we do at the moment was set by Tony Blair in something called the Climate Change Act way back when. So it's more than 14 years, and as Churchill said about the Americans, they can usually be relied on to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. We've tried everything else, it's not working, it's really ruffling people's feathers, it's upsetting people a lot. The chance now is to do it the right way, and if we do it in a sort of small state way, we can still achieve net zero, but we can do it with much, much lower energy bills than we will otherwise be facing.
Now, you've written a report on it, and we're going to come back to that in a couple of minutes. Emma, bring us up to date from the energy companies side. Have you been surprised how toxic a political and almost cultural debate net zero has become? Do we need a new language?
Yeah, I think it's a good point that somehow the way we're explaining this to the public is not always cutting through. And I'm not sure if I asked people in the pub what net zero was, they'd actually be able to give me the answer. I think it's become this thing that we bandy around. In the energy sector, I very rarely use the term net zero, because what I'm talking about is an energy transition which is gathering pace regardless of what you think about climate change. And it is the deployment of technologies of a new energy age. Electric vehicles, electric heating technologies, renewables, batteries. These are technologies which the market wants to deploy because they can see an economic opportunity from them. There are then technologies that we're trying to abate because we understand that they've got negative externalities, and the economists speak, but pollution costs the economy money, and or because we care about climate change. But this economic argument, this industrial argument, this new energy age argument is one the public generally agrees with. As soon as you describe that as being about net zero, you get a different response. And I have to say, in the 5 years I've been doing this job, I've never had a politician kick me out of their office if I'm saying I want to add 240 billion quid to the UK economy, please. I think if I went in and said, I want to talk to you about climate change, I sometimes have a different reception.
Just explain to us what net zero is. That would be tremendously helpful.
So we are trying to reduce our emissions against 1990 base levels of emissions down to net zero levels in the economy. That doesn't mean absolute zero. It means we'll go as far as we can to remove GHG emissions from the economy.
What are those?
They are
greenhouse gases.
Greenhouse gases.
Yeah,
thank you. I was going to list them all for you, but the main one, the main one in energy that we worry about is carbon, because we produce carbon when we burn things, and the netting bit is there is a bit of the economy that's very hard to completely decarbonise, and the idea is that you will net those emissions off with another kind of technology. That I think is quite complicated for people
It is,
to grasp.
just following that here.
Yeah, and it tightened up from an 80% reduction before Theresa May's Net Zero Act. It doesn't mean 100% removing emissions. It doesn't mean even doing it before 2030. It's over the next decades. And the idea is we work through every stage of the economy in order, starting with the easy stuff in power and working our way through to things that are quite difficult, like steel or manufacturing.
If I'm sceptical, Emma, and I hear the word net zero and I just hear that's more taxes for me, as you say, John, that's going to mean me throwing out my boiler, having to get a new car, all expense. We saw the reaction around traffic management under what's called ULEZ, particularly in London, in the Uxbridge by-election. That really showed a reaction from the public. How do you explain to a more sceptical audience what this brings? And I think there's some connection with what I describe as quiet environmentalism of the Conservative Party, which is about protecting the landscape, about conserving the core principle of core principle of conservatism.
Yeah.
And also intergenerational. We worry about our children. Is there a way that you can tackle that skepticism with slightly more emotional arguments, if that's fair?
So there are two frames I think really work for most people, and particularly the centre-right, and we've covered one of those already, which is the vast economic opportunity of doing this, the energy security opportunity if you think about China or the US or Europe investing in these technologies now faster than we are. That works, I think, particularly the idea that of British exceptionalism, technologies we can lead the world in, that sort of heritage of having led the last industrial revolution, that I find very effective for most people. But the other frame, and I'd love to work out how to get this to a broader audience. I come from a very beautiful part of the world. I'm entirely in this job because emotionally I care about that landscape. It is the landscape that my grandmother's brothers farmed. 14 generations of my family are from there. I've gone home and I'm raising my children there.
Where is that?
It's in Stroud in Gloucestershire and the kind of surrounding
yeah.
land. It's an area of outstanding natural beauty. I know because of my work that climate change is one of the biggest threats to that landscape. It's already providing huge challenges to our farmers with increased flooding. We're seeing insect populations plummeting. The landscape has changed in my memory in my lifetime, and as a mother I find that devastating when I think about what I'm handing on to my children. To tackle climate change, I understand I need to build more infrastructure. I need to squeeze fossil fuels out of the economy, and that might mean one day putting a wind farm or a pylon on that landscape. And there are pylons on the hill over from my house. My 2-year-old son thinks they're beautiful because he's never known anything differently. And I love that because when I look at him looking at the pylons in that landscape that my grandmother's family farmed, there is that thread of inheritance, of a value about natural conservatism, which I think we need to articulate much better in the fight that we've got to come.
You see, immediately I'm emotionally with you.
Absolutely.
In a way that I'm not if you start throwing numbers at me and also telling me to do things. How do we make this conversation more positive for the public?
Firstly, we need to engage the emotion, as we just heard, because everybody has got a favourite view. I mean, even if you live in the middle of a city, you'll have a favourite view in your local park or whatever it might be, and everybody understands that, you know, if you concrete all over it, it's gone forever, and we need to preserve these things. And most Brits are, as I think you call it, a quiet environmentalist. And just look at the way that we've all started, doing our recycling, whereas 10 years ago that was kind of a weird thing. Now everybody does it as a normal thing. So we're up for it as a nation. We totally are. But we don't want it to be bossing us around and telling us that we've got to sell our perfectly good car, replace our perfectly good boiler, etc., etc. We want to do it in a way which works for us and ideally does it with cheaper energy at the same time. And there's a couple of things that we could be doing differently. One of it is just simply that we need to rewire the way our energy markets work, because at the moment they are all driven off the international gas prices. The trouble with international gas prices is they bear no relationship whatsoever to the costs of running a wind farm, or the costs of building a battery farm, or the costs of building a solar array. And actually what that means is that the price of our bills are going up and down all over the place all the time. Every time they announce the new price cap every 3 months, it goes up and it goes down. The prices of a wind farm haven't changed very much at all. And that means that those wind farm owners are either making out like bandits, or alternatively, really, really suffering depending on what gas is doing. That's just bonkers if we rewire the way our markets work to reflect reality, to reflect the fact that we've got more and more renewables coming on stream. Actually, you could end up with a very different kind of market, one that's potentially very much cheaper. But you've also got to allow for the fact that we don't want to have to build loads and loads more insurance policy gas plants to cope with the days when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. And at the moment, we are all over the place on that. We aren't coping with that properly. We aren't factoring those costs in. We factor those costs in and then say, right now, how do we do this cleverly? That can make a huge difference, and that will end up with lower bills in the long run.
Now, Emma, I've seen report after report after report that the last government and this new government, we are never going to hit 2050 to be net zero. There just isn't the infrastructure there. There isn't the take-up of the technologies we need to take up as consumers, but also as businesses. It seems quite a bleak landscape, which can leave people thinking, well, why should I make all the effort, spend all this money? It's quite similar to the idea that the UK produces 2% of emissions. Why are we so bothered in this country, given that 98% of emissions come from elsewhere? So just on the first point, it can sound a bit depressing for us as a country to hear we're never going to hit these targets.
We're off track.
Yeah.
The good news is, unlike 10 years ago when I started my career, this doesn't have to be an agenda pushed by the state for climate change reasons onto a market that isn't up for it. I represent all energy technologies for cross-market and cross-system, and we can see the opportunity of electrification regardless of climate change, and the industry is absolutely desperate to make clear to consumers how cheap renewables can be for them. We would like to offer them new tariffs and services for their heat pumps, for their electric vehicles. We'd like to offer them the financing to make those technologies accessible. We fundamentally believe that this is the direction of the private market. The reason we haven't been able to do that is often regulatory. It's often policy in the way. It's planning reform. I'm sure you've heard planning reform at every party at the conference. There is a reason for that. The consent for a new nuclear site for just the environmental assessment is 40 times longer than the complete works of Shakespeare. It takes us 15 years to get a grid connection. We cannot easily offer really dynamic, interesting tariffs to people with electric vehicles without them being loss leading often for the market. We cannot get batteries in the right place on the system. We can't unlock smart data models or smart tariffs for your heat pump. We can't offer financing for your heat pump. We can't even install them because of planning permission. So there is a lot of reason for hope because these technologies are available and the market wants to do them. And there's a lot of reason for hope because a lot of the stuff in our way is regulatory and policy stuff. And don't we all like cutting red tape?
Absolutely. We would hear that today. Go on, John.
I just want to pick up on that because that is the other bit for the Conservative Party and the centre-right, the opportunity to have a proper bonfire of red tape. People talk about this all the time, and where is it? And this is one of the areas where we can make a huge difference, because if we get these couple of rewirings right, we can basically get rid of loads and loads of old-fashioned, clunky old rules. And at that point, we free up enormous chunks of our economy. It's properly conservative free market stuff. It's sitting there. Thatcher would have been proud of supply-side reforms, and we haven't done it, and we should.
Now, John, you used to be an MP. Emma's spoken about her 2-year-old's love for a pylon near the house.
Yeah.
Now, that's lovely to hear, Emma. Are we sure that...
I haven't brainwashed him at all.
No. That lots of people living in communities around the UK are going to be happy to see, as Keir Starmer demanded in his conference speech last week, more pylons, more onshore wind. When you cross the border from England
to Scotland... I'm getting
political
neuralgia, just
when
as
you cross
talk
the
about
border from England to Scotland and you see there have been far more wind farms, onshore wind farms built in Scotland than in England, that change in landscape, I must admit, I really notice, and I'm not thinking, great, bring it on. I want to see many more of these humming white
Some do,
things.
but lots don't. Absolutely.
So
right.
what do we do as a former politician? How do we get more people to be thinking like Emma's 2-year-old? Maybe that's not quite right, but you know what I mean.
so the answer is not to force them and tell them and say, you've got to have it because I say so. That's a disaster. It doesn't have any democratic consent, is guaranteed to get people marching in the streets or in the lanes or in the fields to stop it. The answer, I think, instead is to say, look, if somebody wants to build a wind farm over there in your, within sight of your front room, what will they offer you? Will they offer you a 10-year discount on your energy bill? Those sorts of things. Now, at that point, I may think yes, I may think no, but at that point, it isn't just you've got to have it and tough. It's a proper conversation, and you might actually create democratic consent by saying, we can do you a deal here because we need you to accept this, but here's something which, and it might not be a discount on your energy bills, it could be something else. But either way, it's a proper conversation of people getting to proper consent rather than just being told and forced.
We're not hearing a huge amount of talk, are we, from the Conservative leadership campaigners? We're hearing a lot about immigration. We're hearing a lot about cultural issues. We're hearing hardly anything about the climate. That must worry you.
What we are hearing from all four of the remaining candidates is talk about a small state, which actually is what we're talking about here with this deregulation stuff we were just mentioning. What we haven't seen so far is saying, well, how do you do that? How do you deliver it? One of the opportunities here is to say, if you want to know how to deliver a small state and create one, here's a really good example. It's an absolutely crashingly straightforward one. The ball's at your feet, the net is open in front of you, slot it between the posts.
Now, Emma, obviously your organisation is apolitical. What hope do you have that you can have a new type of conversation with Labour? A lot of people criticise Labour for being very top-down, that they will order people to do things, that this will be all about state intervention. And frankly, a lot of people are going to respond negatively to that.
So we can do the good and the bad. So the nature of energy it's an essential service to the economy and to many businesses, and therefore I find it unlikely that we would ever move away from a model which is essentially a partnership between government and the sector, where government sets the parameters within which they want us to work. One of those is decarbonise, another one is make sure energy is as affordable as possible, target these vulnerable groups and so on. What you tend to get with a change of government is a sort of difference in flavour about where the emphasis is. And so good things that the new government is doing. The ambition is good, the bullishness is good. We are competing for a lot of investment that went over to the US.
Did we lose investment, you think,
there
in this
was
country?
A point where there was a lot of conversation about net zero being bad for the economy, or scepticism about net zero in the press, where I was getting nervous calls from investors, and someone told me they were losing £50 million a week of investment from the UK while all of that was happening, over to the US, which had introduced this program of quite ambitious tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act. We've got competition from Europe. China is by far the biggest clean tech investor in the world. So I think in terms of going into government and making the case for investment, the ambition is welcome. The other thing that's welcome from them is we do need a little bit of the state. And one thing I'd say about wind turbines and pylons is if we know where they're going and communities are confident you actually need them, sometimes they will work with you to understand the national imperative. And the new national system operator, which was started under the Conservative government and has just been instituted under Labour, will do some of that planning. Planning is great. We're up for a bit of strategy. What we don't want them doing is the stuff the private sector does really well. And another massive achievement of the Conservative government was prioritising things like the contract for difference mechanism or competitive auctions for procuring energy generation rather than the state doing it, because that's driven down prices much faster than anyone thought was possible. So long story short, there are some things that the state does really well. There are some things they're entitled to do to direct an essential service to the economy. There are some things they're really terrible at, and I would include technology, iteration, and predictions about pricing in that. And most of all, I think if we can make this attractive for people, if we can make these technologies appealing, if we can give people services, if we can prove that we can help people with their bills, if we can make the economic case, people will come with us on climate change or net zero or whatever else we're calling it.
We could do a lot better, couldn't we, with our housing stock and helping people heat their homes.
Yeah.
We're in the middle of a controversy over the winter fuel allowance. That should surely be part of the discussion about the net zero journey, is just better housing stock.
Yeah, absolutely right. And what people tend to forget when they talk about our housing stock is that people talk about building new homes to ever higher insulation standards. Actually, 90-something% of our built environment is stuff that's been around for decades, in some cases centuries. So you've got to have a retrofit program that turns a 19th century townhouse, a Victorian this or that, into something which is as fuel efficient as possible, because it's a great way, it's one of the most efficient ways of cutting people's energy bills. you've got to do the insulation up in front. But lots and lots of people have spent the last 10 years putting a bit of extra insulation in their loft. When a cricket ball goes through the kitchen window, replacing it with a double or a triple glaze unit, those sorts of things. That comes naturally to people. They can see the effect on their energy bills, and that's the kind of thing which just goes with the grain again, rather than having to be sort of finger-wagging ordered to do things.
There's a really important energy security message about buildings which I'd like to get across as well. And in the middle of the energy crisis, when we were trying to explain to the public why their bills were going up even though we had a secure supply of gas, the answer was because we're exposed to international prices, which the UK can't really influence even as a producer. So the only thing you can do is try and reduce your gas demand, really. 50% of our imports actually go to heat. 80% of the households in the UK have individual gas boilers. That dependency is becoming an energy security risk. And we found that a very powerful argument to people that electrification might also be a way of reducing our dependence on not always friendly countries which control the gas prices that we import.
People will buy that, but the thing that will really persuade them is actually on the day that it becomes cheaper to install a heat pump than a new gas boiler. When my gas boiler conks out, if it's cheaper to put it, at that point we win, and it goes with the grain, and everybody does it because it makes sense to them. That's where we need to get to.
Try putting a heat pump in a small terraced house in
at the moment we are not
place
there.
in Leeds.
No.
That's impossible.
Yeah.
We are just not there yet.
It does seem sometimes like a bit of a middle class, electric cars, heat pumps, all very well for people who live in nice large houses with driveways or charging infrastructure around them. That leaves a huge number of people behind.
Violently agree that we need to spend at least the next 5 years, probably the next 10 years, working out how to do this transition in a way that the public also think is fair. When we poll people, cost obviously comes up, but when you bury into the detail, often it's this idea of fairness. Who gets these technologies? Who benefits from them? How fast will I benefit? Is that fair across society? And I completely agree that we've got to get the cost of electricity down. A lot of that is regulatory again.
It is, but also people are inventing better heat pumps all the time. They're using different kinds of gas in them, all these other things. So the costs of both installing them and then how well they work is getting better all the time. So the faster that the private sector can come up with better bits of kit, so that we get to the point where we all want to do it because it's just cheaper for us, then the argument is won. It's easy at that point. That's where we need to get to.
We may have just breathed new life into the net zero conversation. Thank you, Emma, and thank you, John, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.